Honourable Mr. Michael West.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I'm afraid I should let you know that I might be a while. You could aid me though, Mr. Speaker, if you would protect me from the honourable member of St. Peter and the honourable member of St. James North. Without their interruptions, without their anticipated interruptions, Mr. Speaker, I should be through much sooner than I project. Now, Mr. Speaker, I want to start by making reference to the presentation of the honourable member of St. James North, the Minister of Home Affairs. Particularly so because the lead agency for advice to this government on matters related to drug use, drug abuse, I suppose, matters related to the use of drugs in Barbados. That responsibility rests with them. He took a while, having mentioned all kinds of other entities, before he actually got to what the National Council of Substance Abuse would have submitted to the Joint Select Committee looking at this matter. And when he did make reference to their submission, which was a written submission, they did not appear personally, when he did make reference to their submission, he said of them that they are in support of the initiative to establish or to provide legally for access to medicinal cannabis in Barbados. That is true. What he did not say, and what I would like to point out, Mr. Speaker, and it will take a little while because I'm quoting from the report and their written presentation to the committee, the Joint Select Committee. When therefore considering the outcomes of regulatory changes to allow access to cannabis and cannabinoids for medical use, in addition to considering health risks and benefits for patients, it is important to take into account the potential broader social public health impacts. Their approach is one of stressing caution. It is an approach which I support. It is an approach which we on this side have called for, and which I want to re-emphasize. Let me make it clear for those who easily misunderstand. I am in support of Barbadians having access to cannabis use for medicinal medical purposes. Let me make that clear in case there is anybody, you would have to protect me. You would have to protect me too, Mr. Speaker, for the honourable member from St. Joseph. Of recent date, he has got me in his crosshairs. So I support, and let me be clear about that Barbadians should have access to use of cannabis as a medicinal product to address the various ailments. But I still think that a measure of caution is necessary, and that we should still slow down the rate of pace at which we are pursuing this matter. I'm glad that following the call of the opposition in Parliament here, that the passage of this bill, or the bill, was deferred, and that it was given to the oversight of a Joint Select Committee, and that deliberations were pursued in public, and that various entities across Barbados were allowed to come and make their presentations. there's a moral in that story, Mr. Speaker, that one voice in the midst of the multitude, in the midst of the tumult, can still be heard. And government heard that voice and deferred the passage of this bill and allowed for wider discussion. I still am of the view, Mr. Speaker, that we are not yet at that stage where we should pursue with this bill at this stage for various reasons. Even though I remind us again, for those who are given easily to forgetting, that I support Barbadians having access to the use of cannabis legally for medicinal purposes. Now, the NCSA, the National Council of you're familiar with that entity,
Very familiar.
Mr. Speaker?
Honourable member.
It has always been well led, well guided. And they have been expressing a view which suggests caution. The essence of my presentation this afternoon, Mr. Speaker, will be this. The general thrust of that presentation will be this. I sat as a member of that Joint Select Committee, and it would seem to me that every entity that appeared before that committee and most individuals who made submissions, oral and written, to that committee were stressing the need for caution, and that we do not pursue this at the pace at which we now seem bent on pursuing that. And I'll make reference to some of those entities and perhaps one or two of those individuals. It did not disagree with a move to have medicinal marijuana available to the public of Barbados, but they're expressing certain concerns, some of which have been addressed in changes to the bill, some of which have not been addressed in the bill in its newest iteration. But the bottom line is that they were stressing, let's be a bit more cautious about this and slow down. I heard that repeatedly with my ears as I sat on that committee. And so I have to share with you some of the thoughts of the NCSA. It is important to take into account the potential broader social and public health impacts. A second area of concern, a second point of concern, the NCSA accepts that there is valid reason to prescribe marijuana for medical purposes in the treatment of specific categories of illnesses like those mentioned earlier. However, we are also aware that save for limited jurisdictions, rigorous scientific testing of the use of cannabis as a medicinal remedy has been curtailed by legal restrictions. They are suggesting that they do not necessarily support the view that the science has properly and fully established the use of medicinal marijuana to the extent that many proponents say is the case. These restrictions, especially with respect to growing, production of cannabis, have resulted in a dearth of research into the efficacy of the use of marijuana for medical purposes. This is the National Council of Substance Abuse. This is a government agency. These restrictions, especially with respect to growing and production of cannabis, have resulted in a dearth of research into the efficacy of the use of marijuana for medicinal purposes. And though I would not go so far as to agree that there's a dearth of research, I equally cannot go so far as to say that the science has fully confirmed the worth and usefulness of the product to the extent and for all of those reasons that have been indicated. An overview of the current evidence for the medical use of cannabis and cannabinoids, as well as highlights the limitations of important gaps in the evidence. This emphasizes the need for additional research and clinical studies, including larger and better designed trials, studies looking at dosage and the interactions between medicines, and studies with longer-term follow-up participants. So the case has not been made for the NCSA that the science has established the case fully. The unfortunate development arising from this anomaly is that patients, healthcare professionals, policymakers are without all the evidence they need to make sound decisions regarding the use of cannabis. This lack of evidence-based information on the health effects of cannabis has the potential to pose a public health risk. This is in the NCSA document, Mr. Speaker. In addition, as mentioned earlier, the potential economic benefits of the medical marijuana industry ought to be balanced against the social and public health impacts. And in this regard, we refer to the INCB 2017 report, which cautions that poorly controlled government programs for medicinal use of cannabis can potentially have adverse effects on public health when programs are poorly and improperly mounted. One of the reasons why I persist in my call for a slowing of the rate of pace at which we are proceeding about this, and one of the reasons why several voices that appeared before the committee were expressing caution is because we are totally unaware, we are significantly unaware as to the regulations which will attach to the bill and which will seriously, significantly so, give operationalization to the bill. So we are somewhat operating in the dark when it comes to regulations because they have not been presented with this bill. There's no indication that they're soon to follow the bill. There's no indication as to the manner in which they will be brought to the attention of the public in Barbados. Therefore, this bill is far-reaching in its scope, Mr. Deputy Speaker, from cultivation right up to export and import and all in between, medicinal use, retailing, dispensing, prescribing, transporting, all in between, Mr. Speaker. And we are not aware as to the import of the regulations which will attach to this, and to the extent that we are in the dark. Some people don't like the expression, the devil may be in the details, but the truth of the matter is when we are brought face to face with the regulations, we may find that we're facing challenges as a country or even as a parliament and a government, which we did not anticipate. The report cautions that poorly controlled programs may increase non-medicinal cannabis use among adults, contribute to the legalization of non-medical cannabis use by weakening public perceptions of the risk of using cannabis and reducing public concern about legalizing non-medical, so-called recreational cannabis use, which is contrary to international drug control treaties to which we are signatories. If you be patient, Mr. Speaker, the NCSA is clear that an unequivocal position must be taken with respect to the definition of medical marijuana. That's even that. This is the level of definition. That an unequivocal position must be taken with respect to the definition of medical marijuana and its permitted prescribed uses. It is important not to conflate the issues of recreational use of marijuana with medical marijuana, as seems to be reflected in the report of the CARICOM Regional Commission on Marijuana 2018. The Honourable St. James North, I think, referred to that as well. The Honourable Prime Minister referred to that, and she made it clear that the government at this stage is not about focusing on recreational use of marijuana, but only medicinal use, and will hold its word and have a referendum on further recreational use of the substance. She made that abundantly clear. I'm not questioning that right here. All I'm saying is that the NCSA is saying that you got to be careful that when you attempt to establish this legislative platform for medicinal use of this substance, and you do not do it in a proper fashion, you can create a context in which out there in the public, the perception is had that you've relaxed the laws on the use of recreational marijuana. They're cautioning, therefore, that you be careful as you go forward.